Good afternoon, নমস্কার। প্রথমেই সবাইকে জানাই আন্তর্জাতিক মাতৃভাষা দিবসে অনেক শুভেচ্ছা। Warm greetings of the International Mother Language Day to all. आप सभी को अंतर्राष्ट्रीय मातृभाषा दिवस की ढेर सारी बधाइयाँ। Our mother language is a source of great pride for all of us and is emblematic of our culture and heritage. It's my great pleasure to warmly welcome all of you to this very special session on Central Asia, where we will have the fourth talk of the Exploring Central Asia Talk series, organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. Over the years, the Eurasian region, particularly Central Asia, has been a crucial focus area of the Foundation, manifested through a large number of academic and tractor diplomatic initiatives on this area. The Exploring Central Asia Talk series is a similar initiative by the Foundation, where we have leading experts in Central Asia from across the world talk about the important issues related to the region. The fourth talk of the series will be on the topic Culture, Heritage and Tourism in Central Asia. The talk will be delivered by Sophie Ibbotson, Chairman, Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Mrs. Ibbotson is the Tourism Ambassador of Uzbekistan in the United Kingdom. She also serves as a consultant to the World Bank. The session will be chaired by Dr. Kamakshi Wason, Chief Operating Officer and Director of Academic Programs, Tillotoma Foundation. Thank you so much for being here. Let me now request Dr. Wason to kindly deliver the opening remarks and begin with the session.
Thank you so much, Tulika, for the welcome address. ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਥੇ ਵੇਖ ਕੇ ਚੰਗਾ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ On the occasion of International Mother Language Day, I take this opportunity to remind us all that there is something special, endearing, and unique about our respective mother tongues. Language makes communication so beautiful. Warm wishes on this important day to all of you. I'm glad to be at this special lecture session on the theme of culture, heritage, and tourism in Central Asia. As a part of the Exploring Central Asia Talk series organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. I'm Kamakshi Wason, Chief Operating Officer and Director of Academic Programs, Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation works globally in the areas of international relations, diplomacy, area studies, gender, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. The foundation curates quality academic programs on diverse subject areas. I would firstly like to thank Mr. Soham Das, Chairperson and Director, Tillotoma Foundation, for his generous support and encouragement throughout the course of the ongoing Exploring Central Asia Talk series. The Eurasian region, particularly Central Asia, has been an important focus area of the foundation. We have a dedicated Central Asia Center at the Tillotoma Foundation. Over the years, the foundation has actively cooperated with and worked with institutions, senior experts, and diplomats from Central Asia. The foundation has also organized several high-level track 2 diplomatic conclaves and major international seminars on Central Asia. Today, we are here to discuss about culture and tourism in Central Asia, particularly how promoting tourism can enhance the quality of life for people living in this region. We will be discussing the positive impact of cultural tourism on community development and the role it can play in helping to promote inclusive growth and improve economic opportunities for all. Central Asia is a diverse region with many different cultures and civilizations. It is a continent with a history that goes back several thousand years. In this lecture today, we will discuss the evolution and importance of the cultures of Central Asia, and how the desire to travel and explore this region has motivated people to learn about the history, art, music, food, and lifestyle of these countries. Today, the cultural scene in Central Asia is a popular tourist attraction for many visitors who are interested in learning about the rich history and culture of this fascinating region. Central Asia is also home to several UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Some of the most famous ones are in Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva in Uzbekistan, Merv in Turkmenistan, and so on. The region's unique cultural traditions, historic landmarks, and natural landscapes make it an attractive option for travelers. The various tourist attractions linked to the historic Silk Road offer a glimpse into the region's rich history and culture, as well as its interconnectedness with other parts of the world. The spectacular high-range mountain ranges like Pamir, Tian Shan, and Altai offer opportunities for trekking, mountaineering, and skiing. Central Asia has many beautiful lakes as well. For example, Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan, which is one of the largest alpine lakes. These lakes offer opportunities for swimming, boating, and fishing. I personally believe that with the increasing focus on tourism, culture, and heritage, Central Asia is likely to become an even more popular destination for the world at large in the years to come. Our speaker for today's talk will talk in detail about this. I'm sure that we will have an interesting discussion today. Now, I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished speaker for today, Ms. Sophie Ibbotson, who is the chairperson of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. She serves as the tourism ambassador of Uzbekistan to the United Kingdom. She is also a consultant to the World Bank. Thank you, Sophie, for being here today to speak on this very fascinating topic. I'm sure you will have some interesting insights from your experience to share with us. I'm keen to hear your views on this subject. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this special lecture on the very profound topic, culture, heritage, and tourism in Central Asia. With this, I would now like to request Ms. Sophie Ibbotson to start with the presentation. Over to you, Ms. Ibbotson.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kamakshi, and to the Tillotoma Foundation for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm particularly glad to hear how the Tillotoma Foundation is building ties, both cultural, academic, and indeed economic, between India and Central Asia, because that is where my own interest in Central Asia came from. I actually began my academic work and then later my professional career in India. I studied Hindi and Urdu, so I am very glad to hear the introduction to the talk and the mention of Mother Language Day. I studied South Asian history, and through that, I started to take an interest in Central Asia, although I didn't realize until much later that Central Asia would become so much an important part of my own career. For the past 15 years, it has been my very great pleasure to work across Central Asia. But when I first arrived in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan in November 2008, I knew embarrassingly little about this part of the world, save for its historical ties, in fact, to the Indian subcontinent. When I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, my dissertation had focused on the development of portraiture and political ideology at the Mughal court, and it introduced me in a very small way to the court life in Central Asia as well, and in particular the Timurid history, the Timurid ancestors of the Mughals. My own physical journey to Central Asia also started in India, because in 2008, after leaving university and having been doing some work in India, I decided with some friends that we were going to drive an auto rickshaw, a tuk-tuk, all of the way from India back to the UK. So we started in Darjeeling in West Bengal, we drove to Kolkata, and then we picked up the Grand Trunk Road and drove across India through Varanasi, Delhi to Amritsar, and then through Pakistan and the Karakoram Highway to China, and then crossed over into Kyrgyzstan from there. Actually, life took a twist, and my tuk-tuk never made it further than Bishkek. I abandoned it there, and a new period of my life started in Central Asia. But I do think culturally for me, academically and professionally, it's still very important that my journey and my academic and professional journey and that physical journey by auto rickshaw started first in India. So although I arrived in Kyrgyzstan with very little understanding of the region beyond what I had read in the history books, in the intervening years, I have had countless opportunities to immerse myself personally as well as professionally in all 5 of the Central Asian republics, as well as in Afghanistan. I've been able to discover firsthand the richness of this region, in particular its culture, and the incredibly warm hospitality for which it is rightly famed. Touching briefly on my passion for the Mughals and their history, I have in fact been able to do a number of Mughal pilgrimages across Central Asia. I have been to Afghanistan and to Kabul to see Babur's tomb and Babur's gardens there. I have been to the Fergana Valley and seen Babur's birthplace, and also the fortress at Asikent, where his father was ruler and where he ascended to the throne. And perhaps most significantly, I have been many times to Samarkand, which was the capital of Amir Timur. And this is the city which Babur tried several times to take, hoping that he could follow in Timur's footsteps. But when he failed to take Samarkand, as we all know, he turned his attention south, first to Afghanistan and then to India. My talk today, Culture, Heritage and Tourism in Central Asia, will draw upon my work for Uzbekistan's Ministry of Tourism and Culture, Kyrgyzstan's State Agency for Tourism, and the Committee for Tourism Development of Tajikistan, as well as my experience as a guidebook author for Brat Travel Guides and as director of the Silk Road Literary Festival. I'm going to speak about many of the marvelous, inspiring things happening in these fields, but also the challenges and future opportunities for development. This is because whether we examine these interconnected sectors through a lens of economic, creativity, or conservation, or ideally a combination of all three, a dynamic and responsive approach is essential. This is how we can prevent stagnation, keep improving what we do, and realize potential. For quite some time now, I have thought of culture, heritage, and tourism as different facets of the same thing. Oxford Reference defines heritage as the legacy of people, culture, and environments inherited from the past. In its broadest sense, heritage includes natural and built landscapes, physical artifacts, and cultural forms, for example, music, literature, art, folklore, and monuments. Intangible culture, the values, traditions, customs, and practices, spiritual beliefs and language, and biological traits. The same people, tangible and intangible culture, and natural and built landscapes described in that definition are the foundation on which tourism is built too. We travel beyond our usual environment for personal or business purposes, and that act of movement is a social, cultural, and economic phenomenon. In the past, many governments, including in Central Asia, did attempt to define, regulate, and develop culture, heritage, and tourism separately from one another. But I'm glad to see that increasingly they are taking a more holistic approach. Kyrgyzstan's Agency for Tourism is no longer under the Ministry of Economy as it was when I worked there, but rather it is part of a new Culture, Information and Tourism Ministry. And as of January this year, Uzbekistan's Ministry of Tourism and Cultural Heritage has merged with the Ministry of Culture, becoming the Ministry of Tourism and Culture. In Kazakhstan, the Committee of Culture and the Committee of the Tourism Industry are both under the Ministry of Culture and Sport. This approach across the region allows much greater coordination of activities and, in theory at least, greater efficiency and impact. When I first started traveling in Central Asia 15 years ago, the region was far less open to tourists and to foreigners in general than it is today. And it was far more difficult to get there and to travel between the individual countries. I couldn't get a visa to either Uzbekistan or to Turkmenistan on my first attempt. And getting visas for Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan was bureaucratic, time-consuming affair, which required letters of invitation, consular visits, and sometimes weeks of uncertainty whilst your passport remained locked in the embassy. Now, with the exception of Turkmenistan, which is yet to fully embrace the opportunities tourism offers, the other republics have dramatically reformed their entry requirements. more than 90 nationalities can now visit Uzbekistan visa-free. In Kyrgyzstan, it's around 60 nationalities. In Kazakhstan, more than 70, and in Tajikistan, 62. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan's e-visa platforms also facilitate easier visa processing for those not yet eligible for visa-free entry. This change is a very clear sign of the importance which each country now attaches to the tourism industry, and that they are open for business. Visa reform has been accompanied by reform in the aviation sector and financial incentives to improve air connectivity. It seems now that almost every week a new flight route is launched, in particular to Uzbekistan, where demand is highest. And the entry of budget carriers such as Wizz Air into the market is particularly important in increasing competition and driving down the cost of air tickets. Remarkably, you can now fly from Abu Dhabi to Samarkand, the ancient Silk Road city and so-called gateway to New Uzbekistan, for less than $50 each way. Uzbekistan is a particularly important case study whenever we talk about tourism, and indeed culture more generally, in Central Asia. This is because it is the most populous state in the region, with a population of approximately 35 million people. And historically, a greater proportion of that population has been settled, and therefore constructed more physical monuments, which over time endure better than the less tangible cultural heritage of their nomadic neighbours. Just having these raw materials isn't enough, however. You need to create an enabling environment for business and to invest to stimulate growth. This is why, in spite of having the same population, the same monuments, tourism in Uzbekistan was negligible before 2016, with less than 2 million tourist arrivals a year. What changed in 2016? President Mirziyoyev came to power, and he stated that he had two priorities for his presidency: foreign investment. With that direction from the top, the state machinery mobilized, reform has been rapid, and support for the sector has been consistent, giving domestic and international investors the confidence they need to invest their own resources in tourism in Uzbekistan. From 2016 to 2019, tourist arrivals in Uzbekistan tripled. And although tourism inevitably took a hit from COVID-19, arrival numbers and receipts look set to return to and perhaps even exceed the 2019 record this year. Another reason to focus on Uzbekistan this year is that the country has been chosen to host the 25th UNWTO General Assembly, which will take place in Samarkand in the autumn. This is why Samarkand has been declared as the World Tourism Capital 2023. Almost all of UNWTO's 160 member states will send delegations to Samarkand. And for that week, the recently opened Silk Road Samarkand complex will be the focal point of the world's tourism industry, approving the UNWTO's budget and programme of work for the next 2 years, and debating topics of vital importance to the tourism sector. All eyes will be on Samarkand. I was with the Uzbek delegation at the previous General Assembly in Madrid in 2021, when Uzbekistan won the bid over the other candidate country, Portugal. Not only were the international delegates voting intrigued about Uzbekistan's Silk Road history and culture, but they also wanted to see firsthand how a country with relatively limited financial resources has been able to transform its tourism industry so fast. Yes, there is a romance to the camels and to the desert, the tiled mosques and madrasas, and to the centuries-old bazaars. But one of the things which makes Uzbekistan such an exciting destination is that you can compare and contrast those things with the high-speed Afro-Sayab train, which links Tashkent with Samarkand and Bukhara. You can compare them with Samarkand's extraordinary new international airport, the design of which is inspired by the scientific research of the medieval emperor and astronomer Ulugh Beg. And then There is the stunning world-class hotels, which are opening across the country, including the Intercontinental Tashkent, which opens next month, Mercure Bukhara Old Town, Samarkand Regency Amir Timur, and Hotel Faravon Khiva, all of which are luxury hotels designed to create a superior experience for the domestic and international tourists fortunate enough to stay there. Now, in this second part of my talk, I'm going to discuss 3 of the challenges which the Central Asian republics face in the development of culture, tourism, and heritage, and suggest some potential ways forward. I believe in constructive criticism, as that is how things change for the better. Some of the issues do overlap, and they affect more than one country. The first issue, though it is already improving, is connectivity. How do tourists get to the Central Asian republics and travel between them? I'm not only talking about long-haul visitors, but also those crossing the land borders into neighbouring countries. Aviation in this region is still very expensive. There are multiple reasons for this, including lack of competition, unequal distribution of demand throughout the year, high fuel prices, and, in some cases, state monopolies. The way to reduce the impact of these factors is through regional coordination and liberalisation of the aviation sector, incentivising more private sector investors to enter the market and bring with them not only money, but also expertise in how to run modern, profitable airlines. There are already plans afoot to privatise Uzbekistan Airways, the state carrier of Uzbekistan, and have an IPO, which will inject capital and enable the airline to scale up and offer more routes. The launch of new, low-cost carriers, such as Fly Aristan, a subsidiary of Kazakhstan's Air Astana, and Air Maracanda, operating out of Uzbekistan, is a positive sign so long as they are given fair access to profitable routes. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in particular would benefit from more of these local, low-cost flights, because neither Dushanbe nor Bishkek is going to become a regional aviation hub. Rather, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan need to plan on the basis that long-haul passengers will fly to Kazakhstan or, increasingly likely, to Uzbekistan on major airlines, and then take a short onward flight to their final destination. This approach will also boost tourism numbers from what is frequently called the near abroad, the neighbouring countries which already account for the vast majority of tourist arrivals, but which still have room for growth. Regional connectivity is not just about flights, though. It is also about diplomatic relations and land border crossings, which still facilitate large volumes of tourist arrivals, both citizens of the respective countries and those tourists on multi-country tours. The reopening of the Penji-Kent border between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan has significantly increased tourist flow into Tajikistan's Fan Mountains, as tourists can now get there easily from Samarkand, 2 hours drive away. And I myself have benefited from being able to drive from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan into Uzbekistan's parts of the Fergana Valley. Simplified border procedures and customer service training for border officials not only boost tourist numbers, but they also improve the customer experience, which in turn boosts tourism marketing, as good and bad experiences are all shared by word of mouth. We would, of course, prefer that the words which are being shared are positive, and therefore, if we improve the experience, people will have more good things to say. I haven't spoken much about Turkmenistan because the country's tourism sector is the least developed in Central Asia, and the government doesn't seem to have a particular interest in growing it. However, it is worth mentioning here because closed borders and an unnecessarily restrictive visa regime are holding the country's tourism sector back. There are plenty of fascinating things to see and to do in Turkmenistan, not least the ancient archaeological sites of Konya-Ergenç and Merv, and the infamous Darvaza gas crater. But if tourists cannot easily get visas and cannot cross into the country by land, which is desirable on the so-called 5 Stans tour, they simply won't visit. In recent years, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have both taken a very proactive role in regional diplomacy. They have improved relations with their neighbours, addressed outstanding border issues, and thus increased cross-border flow. Unfortunately, in the same period, the diplomatic relationship between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan has deteriorated, largely due to domestic issues in both countries, which tragically has resulted in unnecessary loss of lives and livelihoods. The closure of border posts, in particular at the Kizil-Ark Pass, has also negatively impacted tourism in both countries, because it is not currently possible to drive the Pamir Highway, one of the world's most dramatic road trips and a major draw for adventure tourists, all of the way through to Osh. A partial drive is better than nothing, and indeed I did that with my parents last summer, but for many people, they want to go from start to finish and therefore need to cross the border. The second challenge is that the Central Asian republics all lack a clear national or cultural identity, and by extension, a clear brand identity which they can promote to the world to sell themselves and their respective tourism sectors. The five republics are often, and I am guilty of this myself, lumped together as the stans, the former Soviet republics, or just Central Asia, with little attention to what makes each country distinct from its neighbours. There are many reasons for this, which off the top of my head include the Soviet-era destruction of indigenous cultures and identities in an attempt to build homogeneity across the Soviet Union, state control of culture and the arts, and a related lack of freedom of speech and expression, underinvestment in cultural education and promotion, language barriers, and a perception that culture has somehow less economic value than other sectors. Since the Central Asian republics became independent in 1991, there have been attempts at nation building and the creation of national identities. National heroes have been drawn from the past. Manas in Kyrgyzstan, Ishmael Somani in Tajikistan, Amir Timur in Uzbekistan, and so on. Certain epics, poems, or historical events have been highlighted as somehow epitomizing the character of the nation, or being turning points in its history. The difficulty, as I see it, is that the borders of modern states are recently constructed, often with little regard to historical precedent or the geographical location of ethnocultural groups. And the ethno-linguistic identities of the majority populations living within those borders are not necessarily the same as those in ancient or even in medieval times. This is why we have strange situations where countries are building their cultural narrative on people and places beyond their modern borders. For example, Uzbekistan's national poet, Alisher Navoiy, was born and died in Herat, in what is now Afghanistan. Tajikistan claims the great Persian poets as its own on the basis of shared language, and mourns the loss of the so-called Tajik cities of Samarkand and Bukhara to Uzbekistan. The result of this is that the identities countries are trying to promote can feel unnatural, artificial, and thus they fail to be adopted by their citizens, let alone to be recognised by the wider world. Nation branding is a very big business, and international agencies like Saatchi and Saatchi are quick to offer their services at great expense. My view, though, is that they have little to contribute. They do not have in-depth knowledge and nuanced understandings of the countries they pitch to work with, nor a vested interest in the outcomes beyond collecting their consultancy fees. And to be authentic and lasting, identity is something which needs to evolve naturally over time. It is not something you can create in a year and expect to have any substance. How then do you create and promote a national identity? You need time and you need freedom. Over years, maybe even decades, you need to encourage, empower, and support your writers, artists, historians, musicians, and others to explore the past and the present of their respective fields without fear or favour. They need to be able to travel domestically and internationally, to develop their expertise, adopt the latest best practice, and engage with new people and new ideas. This requires the state to create an enabling environment, but to let go of the minutiae and stop attempting to control people, their work, and ideas. Controversial, challenging, critical ideas need a platform too. If they are bad ideas, unworkable, unpopular, that's fine. In the mid to long term, individuals and businesses won't fund them and people won't share them. They will die a natural death. But by creating space for creativity and discussion, you also give innovative, dynamic ideas and solutions the chance to come to the fore. And for a vibrant cultural sphere and a vibrant country, that's essential. There are two factors which are going to be critical in enabling this to happen. One is legislation. And there are a number of aspects that I could go into with this, but I think the two most important aspects are, one, rolling back legal efforts at censorship. There are existing laws for libel and for slander, which are more than adequate, but the censorship legislation is often excessive and is often applied in a way which is politically motivated, targeting certain individuals and certain types of ideas. That needs to stop if there is to be freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and a move forward with creativity and cultural development. The other aspect of legislation relates to the second point, which is about funding. At the moment, a lot of cultural projects within Central Asia and across all of the countries in Central Asia follows the Soviet model, which is that the government should finance and control cultural activities. They do this, for example, through the unions of writers, unions of artists, state scholarships for musicians, and so on and so forth. That means that the state is dictating who gets funding and who does not. And creative people are therefore it is necessary to align your creative output with the objectives and politics of the people to fund you. We need to have a situation where there is much broader opportunities for funding, for individuals, for patrons, for businesses to sponsor and support, and for culture to be something which is financially viable in its own right. So, for example, for publishers to be able to recognize the value of books which are proposed to them by writers, and to be able to publish them commercially in a viable way that generates an income which can then be put back into commissioning and licensing the rights for more books and creative output. And the same is true of creating a market for art, for music, for computer games, for theatre, and every other aspect of creativity. There is the opportunity already to do that through existing business models and business structures, but I would also like to see a broadening of legislation for non-commercial activities, so particularly not-for-profit activities. One of the things which I know is very vibrant in India, and particularly led by entities like Jaipur Literature Festival, is literature festivals and cultural festivals. Those events sometimes are profitable, but they don't need to be making a profit for shareholders. And in fact, the best solution is that the money they generate is reinvested in future events, in educational programs, and so on and so forth. In Uzbekistan and the other Central Asian republics, at the moment, the legislation that exists does not facilitate that sort of activity. And so we need to broaden the concept of a not-for-profit organisation or NGO in order to allow these sorts of cultural activities to flourish as well. The final area that I wanted to touch on before moving on to Q&A is an issue of sustainability. And this is critical. We talk about it a lot in terms of tourism, but it is critical for other aspects of culture and cultural heritage as well. Sustainability is often used synonymously with environmental, but actually environment and sustainability are not synonyms. Sustainability is much, much bigger. The environmental pillar is one critical component of it, but I would argue that there is also an economic pillar and a social pillar too. And these three need to be looked at collectively. My concern with tourism in Central Asia at the moment is that the metrics which governments are typically using for assessing success is the number of arrivals. It seems to be that more is better. Every year targets are set. This year we're going to have this many tourists. Then the following year it's going to be this many, increasing year on year. But there is no or much less consideration of what impact those tourists is having. I would far rather that the assessment is done not on how many people cross the border, but in what financial value that they are bringing to the economy, in how many jobs are being created locally, what percentage of the income from tourism is being retained within the country. Those are much, much more important, useful metrics than how many people physically cross the border as tourists. When we start looking at that as well, we can look more about the social and environmental impact of tourist activities as well. There is evidence in Central Asia that a number of historically and culturally important sites have been damaged by tourism, and this is by no means something which is specific to Central Asia. It happens all over the world, but it's something that we need to be critically aware of and make sure we can manage better in the future. There is no point in commercializing your culture and your sites and your history if the result is that you end up damaging it and losing it for future generations. So there needs to be a balance between the preservation, conservation, protection of your culture, your intangible culture, as well as your physical monuments, so that they can be developed for tourism, but preserved in a meaningful way as well. I'm aware that we are running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to end by saying, come to Uzbekistan, come to Kyrgyzstan, come to Tajikistan, come to Kazakhstan. The very best way for you to appreciate the culture and the heritage and the tourism potential of these countries is to experience it for yourself. And by coming, you also participate and contribute to their ongoing development. Well, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Sophie, for your interpretive address on this very interesting topic. Your remarks were both enlightening and thought-provoking. You highlighted some of the key considerations in terms of culture, heritage, and tourism in Central Asia. You spoke about the socio-cultural and economic impact of the region on tourism, and I can consider why this is such a significant point. Central Asia is a land of culture and heritage. It has a wealth of historical and cultural treasures to be explored, and it is important for locals and visitors to appreciate these unique aspects of the region's identity. The role of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in ensuring that local tourism and heritage development strategies are in line with the cultural economic requirements of the region and is important for the development of the sector as the whole. It is also important to ensure that the economic benefits of tourism are shared by local communities to ensure that sustainable development is achieved. The Silk Road history is undoubtedly an amazing aspect, and the impact it has had on the people of Central Asia and the world is undeniable. The role of artists, curators, and anthropologists in promoting cultural and artistic traditions, the broader issues of Central Asia's larger artistic scene, and the importance of heritage conservation and restoration are also crucial elements for development. Also, air travel has been a part of the story for centuries and will continue to play an important role in the future as well. In your talk, you greatly highlighted your own personal experience with Central Asia and how it has shaped your perspectives on tourism development and heritage preservation in the region. As well as sharing your own personal knowledge and experience, you also mentioned other key points that are important for the development of the tourism sector in the region. I commend your thoughts and observations on this very important topic, and I look forward to more insight from you in the further interactive question and answer round. Thank you once again. Now let's take some questions. Okay, so I have a question. What role have religion and spirituality played in shaping the cultural traditions for Central Asia?
So the role of religion has been very, very important in creating the cultural identity of the region. Uzbekistan is a majority Muslim population today, but it has a very ancient history, including of Buddhism and of Zoroastrianism. And in fact, because of the Silk Road heritage of the region, There is even evidence of Hinduism in some of the sites in southern Uzbekistan, and of Nestorian Christianity. So all of the faiths which traveled through and along the Silk Road found a place in Uzbekistan, and indeed across the region. The challenge was that in the 20th century, with the arrival of communism, there was very, very strong repression of religious ideas. And so all of the nuances of religions, which although Islam was the dominant faith by the early 20th century, there were still aspects of these ancient faiths combined with local versions of Islam, that the state tried to eradicate all of that. And within 2 or 3 generations, a lot of the lived traditions relating to religion had been lost and forgotten. Since 1991, there have been attempts to revive that. But what it means is that the traditions and the practices at a family level are not unbroken. The attempts now to revive religion are, as I was saying, with the creation of national identity, there is a certain amount of artificiality in trying to construct a new version of different faiths in the region, and that does include importing ideas from the Middle East, from South Asia, and from other places. And the governments are understandably quite wary about this. They are aware of the threat of extremism, and not just coming from Islam, but also potentially from evangelical Christian groups and from other faiths. And so there is still a certain amount of skepticism about religion. However, it is undeniable that faith and religious practice has influenced the cultural heritage of all of the regions, in the architecture, the food, the dress, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for you sharing your useful insights. Next question. How do you look at the renewed interest in the Silk Road history and narrative in the recent decades, due to various reasons, including political, affected the progress and development of cultural tourism in Central Asia?
The Silk Road has been, and the concept of the Silk Road has been hugely influential in the revival or the development of tourism in Central Asia. It has very romantic associations, and people want to be able to travel through the deserts, to see the camels, to see the magnificent architecture, and to experience themselves. And actually, Uzbekistan in particular does embody those stereotypes of the Silk Road far more than anywhere else in the world. I think the only place that would possibly rival that in terms of public imagination is Iran, and because of the political situation there at the moment, it's very difficult for people to go to Iran, and therefore Uzbekistan is benefiting from the desire that people have to see and experience the Silk Road. It's also a very important way of thinking and conceptualizing the cultural and the economic development of the Central Asian publics in the past and today. And a lot of the political rhetoric that we hear from the government is about re-establishing those ties with the past. I think we are moving away from the situation where the Central Asian republics just look north to Russia and to other parts of the former Soviet Union. And instead, the narrative is about re-establishing ties with China, with Iran, with Afghanistan, and with South Asia as well. There have been a number now of connectivity conferences, and looking particularly at ways that we can increase trade between South and Central Asia, both in terms of trade agreements, but also what may or may not take place, but the Trans-Afghan Railway, which the intention of which is to get goods from Central Asia down to the Gulf and be able to ship out from the ports, particularly in Pakistan.
Thank you so much, Sophie. If you could throw some light into the problem of red tapeism and tourism in Central Asian republics, particularly in the context of, getting visas, etc.
So as I mentioned in the talk, most of the republics now have made it much, much easier the lists of number of countries which are eligible for visa-free entries is growing every year. Uzbekistan is ahead of the others with about 90 countries, and then an e-visa option for the others. There are, of course, still some countries which are not, or some nationalities which are not eligible for e-visas or for the visa-free regimes. And that does become difficult if they have to apply via an embassy, given that there's not necessarily embassies in those countries. There is always a diplomatic element to these agreements. Interestingly, with Uzbekistan, despite the fact it has 90 countries have visa-free access, one of the countries which does not is the United States. And people always think that this is an anomaly, but I do feel that it is a reflection of the diplomatic relationship, and that Uzbekistan quite rightly is saying to the United States, okay, we would give you visa-free access, but we expect something in exchange. That's the nature of diplomatic negotiations. And so you do see that when Uzbekistan or the other republics are investing in their diplomatic relationship with another country, that offering visa-free access or option to join the e-visa regime is a token of the improved relationship.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So we have received a number of questions related to India. So I will try to summarize them in one wide question. How do you see India as an important partner of Central Asia in the areas of culture and tourism, given the historical and cultural linkages, etc.? And how can this partnership be further boosted?
There is huge potential for tourism between the two regions on topics of history and of culture. So Buddhism obviously traveled from India to Central Asia, and particularly to Uzbekistan. So there is the Buddhist ties, there is the Mughal history ties, there is the history of Timur. There are some linguistic overlaps as well. There is textiles, trade, so all sorts of heritage ties. And we are seeing actually already increased tourism flow in both directions between Uzbekistan and India, and actually to some extent between Tajikistan and India as well, because there are important Buddhist sites in Tajikistan as well. There is not yet enough air connectivity between the two countries. There is a direct flight, I believe, from New Delhi to Dushanbe and to Tashkent, but we need a lot more flights and additional airlines to provide the additional planes to make that connections grow. Currently, India has e-visa access to Uzbekistan. I would like to see it added to the visa-free list. That again would facilitate a greater number of people traveling between. In terms of the products which I think Central Asia can sell and promote itself to tourists coming from India, other than the Buddhist aspect, the two I think have greatest potential is one, promoting its Islamic pilgrimage sites and the Islamic cultural heritage. So, for example, Imam Bukhari, author of the Hadiths, his shrine is in Samarkand. I know in India there are many followers of the Naqshbandi school of Sufism, and Naqshbandi's burial site is in Bukhara. So there are important religious sites which people can visit. The other one, however, is adventure tourism. And Uzbekistan particularly, but also Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, have been investing in their winter sports tourism. So there are now fantastic ski resorts, and there are a number of other resorts under development. So for Indians who are interested in affordable, relatively close by, high quality winter sports tourism, Central Asia is a much more obvious destination than, for example, having to travel to Europe for skiing and snowboarding.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie. Next question. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the tourism industry in Central Asia, and what measures have been taken to mitigate its impact?
The biggest impact was on, obviously, arrivals. All of the countries shut their borders and stopped flights. So overnight, the tourist numbers fell. And in fact, Turkmenistan still has not reopened its borders for tourists. It hasn't entirely been a catastrophe, though, in the same way that it has been in other destinations. So first of all, I have seen a lot of development and investment in domestic tourism during the COVID-19 period. And this is very, very important because it means that people are able to discover their own countries for themselves, that there is, rather than being all of the tourism concentrated in a few months in the year in high season, that actually if people are traveling domestically, that they are spreading out tourism around the year and removing or reducing those peaks and troughs, making it much more efficient and viable business model. At the same time, I've seen a lot of evidence that the countries and the donor organizations that they work with have been investing in infrastructure while things are quiet. If you think about a city such as Khiva, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, if there are tourists there all of the time and it's very, very crowded, actually it's very difficult to do any infrastructure work. What they made sure they did during COVID, when the tourist footfall was reduced, was to take up all of the paving in the old city, to put all of the water pipes and electricity lines, which previously had been sort of chaotically spread all over the place. They sunk them underground and relaid the paving. So now the aesthetics of the old town is preserved, that modern infrastructure is hidden from sight, and the surfaces that people walk on are better. So that sort of project has been very, very helpful. Similarly, pre-COVID, a lot of the construction workforce in Central Asia would go as migrant labor to Russia. During COVID, they returned home, and therefore they were able to work on local projects, including the construction of new hotels. So we've seen a huge number of new properties opening, built to a very, very high standard, because the workforce was at home, not working abroad.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think this Q&A round is going on very interesting. This is going on very interestingly ahead. Next question I have is that which kind of tourist destinations in Uzbekistan do you think are getting more tourist attraction in recent times? Like if you can segregate it in a historical period wise or type wise, by giving a particular reason behind it.
So the first type of tourism product which grew and was invested in Uzbekistan was cultural tourism, and particularly tourism to the Silk Road cities, the UNESCO World Heritage Sites of Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, and Shakhritsabz. And in some ways, this was the easiest kind of tourism to develop because the cities and their magnificent monuments were already there. So that is what we saw grow first, and that is still growing year on year. What we're seeing now, however, is a diversification in the types of tourism which are being developed and sold, and also the regions of Uzbekistan. So people are moving beyond that central corridor, which would be the equivalent of India's Gold Triangle, and exploring other parts of the country. I personally am very interested in the archaeology of Uzbekistan, and there are two particular areas which I think are fascinating for those with an interest in archaeology. One is Secundaria in southern Uzbekistan, which is close to the Amudarya, the Oxus River. And there are a number of important sites there, including Kampir Tepe, also known as Alexandria on the Oxus, Old Termiz. This is where the Buddhist monasteries of Fayez Tepe and Kara Tepe are, and the Kirghiz fortress or caravanserai. So there's a concentration of archaeological sites there. The other concentration of archaeological sites is in Karakalpakstan, which is an autonomous republic in the western part of Uzbekistan. And there are more than 50 desert fortresses there, some of which are in a remarkable condition, despite the fact they're more than 2,000 years old. So archaeology certainly is something which has great potential for growth and to bring people into new areas. Beyond that, there is a growth in handicrafts tourism and appreciation of the applied arts, in agritourism, particularly because the Fergana Valley region of Uzbekistan is incredibly fertile, and in ecotourism and adventure tourism. If we had been talking about tourism 5 years ago, people would have said, oh yes, go to Uzbekistan for culture, but go to Tajikistan or to Kyrgyzstan for adventure. That is no longer the case, because Uzbekistan has always had the same potential for adventure tourism. It has got the deserts, it has got the mountains, it has got the lakes, rivers, and so on and so forth. What is happening now is that the tourism sector has identified the potential of these areas, and there are great opportunities for hiking, mountain biking, horse riding, swimming, camping, and in the winter skiing and snowboarding, which are encouraging people to get out into these more remote rural areas and capitalize on the natural environment and enjoy that as part of the tourist experience.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for sharing your insights on archaeology. I personally am very fascinated by this subject. Next question. How has the ongoing war in Ukraine affected the tourism industry in Central Asia in particular and Eurasia in general? How is the industry coping with the challenges?
So the Russian invasion of Ukraine has affected Uzbekistan and the Central Asian republics in several ways. First of all, if we talk about flights from Europe, actually a lot of the airlines have had to change their flight paths, and so the flight times getting to Central Asia from Europe are longer because they are having to fly round to avoid airspace in Russia and Ukraine. Secondly, and fortunately I would say this is in a small way, there are still a lot of people who do not realise that the Central Asian republics are independent countries. They still think part of the Soviet Union or satellites of Russia. And so there are a small number of people who have been deterred from visiting because they think it is close to Russia. I do always try and remind them that actually London is closer to Moscow than Tashkent is to Moscow. And it's, yes, a geographical failing on their part that they don't necessarily understand that. The other impact that the war has had is that there has been a significant increase in arrivals in Central Asia from Russia, and to some extent from Ukraine and Belarus as well. There are a lot of young professionals who left Russia the beginning of last year because they did not want to live anymore under the Putin regime. They wanted to be able to run their businesses apart from sanctions and not affected by the restrictions which Putin was imposing. And then in the latter, or sort of second part of the year, when Putin began conscription, a lot of young men who were fearful that they would be conscripted into the army against their will also left to Central Asia then, because it was seen to be a safe place, but somewhere where they could still speak Russian and have a degree of cultural familiarity, and importantly, where they did not need a visa to be able to travel at short notice. So we have seen large numbers of arrivals from Russia and also from Ukraine and Belarus of people seeking sanctuary in Central Asia, which is a reversal of the migration which was happening previously when the migrant labour were going from Central Asia to Russia for work. Now we're seeing a flow of people in the opposite direction.
Thank you, Sophie. Next question. What are some of the challenges faced by tourism industry in Central Asia and how are they being addressed?
I think there are a number of challenges, some of which I touched on in my talk. One is that I think we need to have much better regional coordination, and that is at a diplomatic level, but also in terms of economic ties and making it easier for tourism businesses to operate cross borders, because there are a lot of people who, particularly if they're traveling long haul, do not want to visit just one country. They would be very keen to visit, for example, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan together, and that needs to be made easier for them to do. Other challenges affecting the region, a desperate lack of skilled staff. There are efforts to establish new tourism universities, in particular the Silk Road Tourism University in Samarkand, which is very good, but they are not yet able to meet the demand for qualified, experienced tourism professionals. So there is lots of opportunities for people to get involved with training, but also skilled professionals looking for jobs should be looking at Central Asia at the moment. They're desperate for tour guides, desperate for hotel managers, sort of desperate for chefs, so people working across the sector. So needing to address the human resources element. There are many, many other issues I could chat about. I mean, I think probably one other that bears mentioning is that the financial sectors in each of the Central Asian republics are still not fully modernized and fully connected with international standards and international systems. And that can make transferring money in and out of the region difficult, and it can also make card payments difficult. So I know, for example, with the e-visa websites for both Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, frequently people with foreign bank cards get quite frustrated trying to make payments and the glitches in the system. So I'm hoping, given that the technology for e-commerce now exists and is tried and tested all over the world, that there will be greater integration of existing e-commerce systems to make it easier for businesses to take payments online, but also to take card payments. And that will make it easier for the tourist, but it will also enable tourism businesses to capture and retain a greater proportion of tourist spend in country.
Thank you, Ms. Ibbotson. Also, if you can talk a bit about the conservation of heritage, both tangible and intangible, in the states of Central Asia, what strategies have been adopted, etc.
I'm glad to say that UNESCO has got a big presence now in Central Asia and a lot of influence, and is working closely with national and local governments on the preservation of sites. It is always a learning process. A lot of mistakes have been made in the past and continue to be made. Some of that is due to corruption, some of that is due to lack of expertise and local skills. But I do think it is improving generally. The important thing is to make sure that the planning for archaeological planning for sites of historic and cultural heritage interest is done to high standards, and that it is done in a sustainable way that recognises not only the commercial potential of the sites, but also their historical and scientific value and the importance of the surrounding environment. So taking a holistic approach on the planning, making sure that adequate funding is available, because with thousands of historical sites, you do need to prioritise which are going to be funded and make sure that money is there, or they will fall down, or work will be done to a substandard. And then making sure that when contracts are awarded for restoration work, that the contracts are given to suitably qualified companies, and that their work is monitored to make sure that they do what they're supposed to, that they don't cut corners.
Thank you, Sophie. How have traditional handicrafts and folk art been passed down through the generations in Central Asia? And what are some of the efforts to preserve and promote these art forms?
The Museum of Applied Arts in Tashkent, I think, is one of the best museums anywhere in Central Asia. And they're doing a really good job of preserving historic examples of the different applied arts, but also promoting them to a new generation. There is the Hunamand Association, which is the Handicrafts Association working in Uzbekistan, which again is working with artisans to develop new products and to find increased routes to market for them. Because the important thing is making sure, and this goes back to something I was talking about earlier in my talk about making sure that there are funding streams. Handicrafts is something which should be able to stand on its own 2 feet commercially as a sector, because there is demand for products and obvious ways of paying artisans, because people want to buy their products. So making sure that the artisans are producing good quality products, that there is consistency in supply and in quality, and that they are connected to retail outlets. E-commerce is a part of this, but also making sure, for example, that museums have got museum shops where people can buy local crafts as well as postcards and books, making sure that hotels, again, another option for retail for these products, and having the opportunity for artisans to travel and develop their skills and meet with other artisans. There was, just before COVID, a very large international handicrafts festival in Kokand in the Fergana Valley, which brought artisans from all over the world. And I know that craftsmen from Uzbekistan have been to India in recent years to participate in some of the handicrafts fairs there. So this exchange of ideas and skills is very, very important to ensure that not only skills are retained, but also that they develop, and people have new ideas and experiment with new ways of doing things.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Can you connect the ongoing crisis over resources, which include fuel, as well as daily material like food grains, to tourism and cultural promotion?
In terms of Central Asia, I think the biggest issue is going to be water and climate change. These are already desert states, maybe high altitude deserts in the case of Tajikistan and Pamir, but water is going to be a critical concern going forward. The issue of energy security in some ways is less of a problem because they are relatively resource, or certainly in the case of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, relatively resource rich, producing oil and gas. And Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have the water resources for hydropower. The issue has been not that the raw materials don't exist, but the infrastructure has not been developed to keep pace with the growth in population. So we've seen this winter, there have been particularly cold weather, and the existing infrastructure has not been able to keep pace with demand. And a lot of people went without heating for several weeks. This demonstrates the need for investment, both state investment in infrastructure, but also private sector investment to really upgrade those systems to make them fit for the 21st century, for the buildings that people are living in, and for the population growth, which is something that certainly the energy suppliers have not factored in. The energy is there in terms of the water, the sun. I mean, there's a lot of interest in solar power and the fossil fuels as well, but that needs to be converted into usable forms of energy for people to make use of.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And also I want to ask, how have Central Asian languages evolved over time? And what are some of the challenges faced by language preservation efforts in the region?
So the languages in Central Asia predominantly fall into two groups. Tajik is a Persian Iranic language and actually is very, very close to Farsi or to Dari in Afghanistan. It is written in different script, but in terms of being mutually intelligible between speakers, there is very much from that group. The languages of Kyrgyz, Kazakh, Uzbek, Uyghur, Karakalpak are all Turkic languages. So they are a completely different language group, both with their own interesting traditions and literary heritage. One of the challenges that the languages are facing, however, is that over the course of the 20th century, their scripts have changed repeatedly. So at the beginning of the 20th century, they were all where they were written down, written in Perso-Arabic script. Then they were changed to Latin script. Then they were changed to Cyrillic script. And now in some cases have gone back to Latin as well, albeit with certain variations to reflect the local sounds. This means that there is a lack of continuity in literature and that people often are unable to read past literature, including historical manuscripts and sources, because they're written, even though they might understand the words if they were spoken, they cannot read the script they're written in. And as yet, not enough has been done to digitize those earlier texts and translate them or transliterate them into the languages that people are speaking in today. So there is a historical disconnect. There are also some challenges in terms of communicating regionally. And this is why Russian, which was really introduced in a major way to Central Asia in the late 19th century and became the lingua franca during the Soviet Union, is still so widely used, because it is a language which enables people across the region to communicate together. It's still the dominant language in higher education for a lot of people in diplomacy and in business as well.
Thank you, Sophie. Do you think the fall of the US-backed regime in Afghanistan has affected the connectivity between Central Asia and South Asia? Isn't it much more unstable and unpredictable?
I think actually the situation in Afghanistan has created a very interesting change in the dynamics in Central Asia. Previously, whenever we talked about Afghanistan, the talk, as you say, was about the involvement of the USA, about Europe, about negotiations happening in Doha, and so on and so forth. I think that in the past year and a half, we have seen a shift in attention to South and Central Asia. And I would argue that the Afghanistan that we have in 10 years' time will be influenced much more by policymakers and diplomatic and economic efforts from South and Central Asia than any attempts to influence policy from further afield. Tashkent in particular has been taking the role of regional negotiator. Even before the fall of the Taliban, they did host sort of peace conferences for Afghanistan in Tashkent, and that has continued since the return of the Taliban. We're also seeing that Uzbekistan is pushing quite heavily for the Trans-Afghan Railway, which implies that the government in Tashkent does think that a diplomatic and commercial or economic relationship with Afghanistan can be had in the future. They have been quite clear so far that they do expect, as is the international position, that the Taliban will not be given recognition as the government of Afghanistan until they have a I've forgotten what the exact term is. It's not a government of national unity, but a government which is more representative of the people of Afghanistan and which is observing a greater proportion of the human rights and meeting their international obligations. However, it does seem to be that they are taking an approach of offering an incentive to say to Afghanistan and to say to the Taliban in particular, if you meet the expectations of the international community and meet the minimum requirements, then we are prepared to engage with you. They're not taking a position of completely isolating Afghanistan. There's a recognition that a relationship could be had. It could be productive for both parties if Afghanistan and the Taliban are prepared to make certain concessions to international norms.
Thank you, Ms. Sophie Ibbotson, for being here today with us. We had a successful discussion on today's theme, culture, heritage, and tourism in Central Asia. I found your perspectives on this topic highly interesting and informative. It is always important to understand different perspectives, as sometimes it can open your eyes to new opportunities and areas of interest. We enjoyed your presentation on culture, heritage, and tourism in Central Asia. I found your perspective on this topic very interesting and informative. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. And I also look forward to our next session on the Exploring Central Asia Talk series. I would like to thank our attendees for joining us today for the Exploring Central Asia Talk series. I hope you all had a great learning experience. I would now like to request my colleague, Ms. Tulika Karmakar, Deputy Coordinator, New Delhi office, to give closing remarks.
I take this opportunity to formally conclude this fantastic session on culture, heritage, and tourism in Central Asia as a part of the Exploring Central Asia Talk series organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. I especially thank Ms. Sophie Ibbotson from Royal Society for Asian Affairs for her insightful address. It was lovely to hear you. Hope to have you again at the Tillotoma Foundation soon. The session has been effectively chaired by Dr. Kamakshi Wason, Chief Operating Officer and Director of Academic Programs, Tillotoma Foundation. We had an excellent discussion at this special session on diverse dimensions of culture, tourism, and heritage in Central Asia. Thank you all for joining. Looking forward to hosting you for the subsequent talks of the Exploring Central Asia Talk series organized by the Tillotoma Foundation.